share this with other folks. An important word tonight. I've been told I need to give people a little bit more time to get on, so I'm trying to do a little bit more of that. Those of you who watch me know how I am. I'm very punctual, and so I just get started. On June 16, 2020, a very prominent white male evangelical pastor did a sermon on how Christians should respond to the riots. He took an hour and 15 minutes to survey many scriptures that had to do with submission and suffering. And then combining these verses with his objection to the LGBTQ philosophy of Black Lives Matters, the organization, he concluded that Christians, hence African American Christians, should not march in Black Lives Matters protests, but submit themselves to the governing authorities, suffer, and wait for God to deliver them. I'm sure that this pastor is unaware of the fact that this is the same rhetoric that the slavers used to persuade slaves that the Bible affirmed their slavery. The slaves with little education knew better than to accept that kind of biblical interpretation. And I pray with much more biblical knowledge today that we know better than to accept that kind of interpretation. Furthermore, this biblical interpretation skips many other parts of the Bible and treats Jesus as a passive person who went silently to crucifixion, rather than the Son of God who practiced nonviolent resistance against the Roman government, who sought to reframe Israelite religion by turning over tables of the money changers in the temple. Jesus was not just a passive person, not to mention the fact that this teaching is offered by, or was offered by, someone who was aligned with the power structure and seeks to maintain that structure. This perspective also ignores the entire prophetic biblical impetus to speak true to power. This ancient rhetoric deserves a response. So I'll respond tonight by touching on four realities: the moment, the motto, the movement, and the organization. First, the moment. Derek Chauvin putting his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds created a unique moment in time. This unique moment is a crossroads. A crossroads is plural in form, but it can be used as singular in its construction. We'll use the singular construction. A crossroads is a place of intersection of two or more roads. A crossroad is a crucial point, especially where a decision must be made. The crossroads that we are talking about and we are standing at right now is: how do we deal with institutional or systemic racism? How do we deal with implicit or unconscious bias? How do we deal with peaceful protests? How do we deal with looting and rioting that has erupted because of the tragic death of another unarmed black man at the hands of the police? And so something unique has happened. The death of George Floyd and this crossroad could be a turning point. That remains to be seen. Nevertheless, something feels vastly different about this moment. Number two, some people have a problem with the motto, Black Lives Matter. They feel they need to push back. All lives matter. All lives are not experiencing systemic racism and implicit bias. I give this little story to people. I hope it helps. If my house is on fire and I call the fire department, when they arrive, my house matters. This doesn't mean that other houses don't matter. All houses on the street matter, but their houses aren't on fire. Who would come out of their houses and protest and say all houses matter? Yet the houses of African Americans have been on fire, our house, for 401 years. So Black lives matter. That's all that's being said by that particular motto. Some folks are now beginning to push back against the notion of systemic racism and white privilege because they have bought into or been co-opted or they've been enculturated to the dominant way of seeing things. supposed black conservatives are saying that there is no such thing as systemic racism. They have swallowed what Cornel West calls the historic amnesia of America. America cannot remember what it has done to the American Indians, to slaves, to Japanese and Chinese during World War II, etc. And I'm so tired of this lame pushback that I'm going to give some information about systemic racism this evening. The impact of systemic racism is demonstrated in a book called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein, who is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute, a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and a fellow of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. The Color of Law incontrovertibly makes clear that it was the de jure segregation, that's legal segregation, the laws and policies, decisions passed by the local, state, and federal governments that promoted the discriminatory practices that continue even to this day. Let me give you a number of them. If government had declined to build racially separate public housing in cities where segregation hadn't previously taken root, and instead had scattered integrated developments throughout the community, those cities might have developed a less racially toxic faction with fewer desperate ghettos and more diverse suburbs. But this was because of the law. If the federal government had not urged suburbs to adopt exclusionary zoning laws that many are still on the books, white flight would have been minimized because there would have been fewer racially exclusive suburbs to which frightened homeowners could flee. If the government had told developers that they could have FHA guarantees only if their homes were built and open to all, integrated working class suburbs would likely have matured with both African Americans and whites sharing those benefits. If you're just tuning in or you don't know what I'm doing, I'm listing legal perspectives and laws that are on the books and at the local, at the state, and at the federal level that have created the systemic racism that we are experiencing today. Now, I'm not talking about the psychology of them, not talking about the sociology of them. I'm just talking about the laws that are on the book. If state courts had not blessed private discrimination by ordering the eviction of African American homeowners in neighborhoods where association rules and restrictive covenants barred their residence, middle class African Americans would have been able to gradually integrate previously white communities as they developed the financial means to do so. If churches, universities, and hospitals had faced the loss of tax-exempt status for their promotion of restrictive covenants, then most likely they would have refrained from such activity. If police had arrested rather than encouraged leaders of mob violence when African Americans moved into previously white neighborhoods, racial transitions would have been smoother. If real estate commissions had denied licenses to brokers who claimed an ethical obligation to impose segregation, those brokers might have guided the evolution of interracial neighborhoods instead of their segregated practices. If school boards had not placed schools and drawn attendance boundaries to ensure the separation of black and white pupils, families might not have had to relocate to have access to education for their children. If federal and state highway planners had not used urban interstates to demolish African American neighborhoods and force their residents deeper into urban ghettos, black impoverishment would have lessened, and some displaced families might have accumulated the resources to improve their housing and its location. If the government had given African Americans the same labor market rights that it gave to other citizens, African American working class families would not have been trapped in lower income minority communities from the lack of funds to live elsewhere. If the federal government had not exploited the racial boundaries it created in metropolitan areas by spending billions on tax breaks for single family suburban homeowners while failing to spread adequate funds on transportation networks that could bring African Americans to job opportunities, the inequalities on which segregation feeds would have been diminished. If federal programs were not, even to this day, reinforcing racial isolation by disproportionately directing low-income African Americans who receive housing assistance into segregated neighborhoods that government had previously established, we might see many more inclusive communities. These are just some of the legal policies and laws that support systemic racism. We have not even begun to discuss philosophic, emotional, cultural components of the system. All right, I got that out my system. Let's deal. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter movement. The American movement is being populated and powered by white millennials who are outnumbering African Americans. This is unique. It's the first time it's ever happened, I believe, in the history of America. And the impetus of the movement revolves around defunding the police and reforming the police. I want you to know, and I'll talk about that another time, I'm not in favor of defunding the police. We need police, but there must be police reform. But there are people, not just in America, they are protesting around the world. This is an incredibly unique movement. Never has a movement been populated by whites in this way. Whether Christians participate in this overwhelming peaceful march or protest right now is moot, since the movement is not being driven by the church. Finally, let's deal with Black Lives Matter organization. There is an LGBTQ narrative undergirding the Black Lives Matter organization. Here is a quote from blacklivesmatter.com. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable, end of quote. The word disrupt is a very instructive and serious word. It does not point towards rights, but a subversive agenda. I affirm the intrinsic and inherent worth of all people, because God is the creative Father of all people. All people have basic and innate worth. This includes those who are lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgender, queer, and any other designation that is being used today. I am opposed to any and all forms of violence against LGBTQ individuals, and I believe that they should be accorded the basic civil rights that all American citizens are due, that is, insurance benefits, protection, etc. Furthermore, I believe that we, the Church of Jesus Christ, should do more than merely tolerate these fellow brothers and sisters. We should actively love them and seek to minister to them. I believe that should be the position of loving Christians. Simultaneously, I'm opposed to changing the definition of marriage, not due to any animus or hatred towards LGBTQ persons, but because it violates God's design for one man and one woman union, and it will ultimately destroy marriage as a viable social institution by opening the door to polygamy, having more than one spouse at a time, polyamory, various relationships involving multiple partners. We are convinced that groups, marriages, mixing any number of people together in same sex and mixed sex union is not good social policy for any nation. Therefore, despite the culture and the atmosphere of intolerance towards any person who would disagree with the LGBTQ agenda, we must lovingly stand against the redefining of marriage as the union between a man and a woman. We must also speak against adultery because our reticence to do so reveals prejudice on our parts. Yet, because I disagree with the philosophy of Black Lives Matter organization does not mean that I must distance myself from the moment, the motto, or the movement. The Bible is the story of an opportune moment when nailed to the cross by the hands of godless men. Jesus yielded his spirit to the Father to facilitate reconciliation of people to his Father. And although I don't believe God orchestrated the death of George Floyd any more than I believe God wanted Jesus crucified, it's just like God to use this despicable moment to bring about a remarkable transformation. Paul tells us in Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. The text does not say God causes all things, but that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God. God is an omnicompetent God. Glory to God. He is competent to take any situation and work something good out of it. He doesn't cause the situation, but he can cause them to work together for good. Therefore, don't overlook this moment. There is nothing that keeps us Christians, African American or otherwise, from embracing the Black Lives Matter motto. The motto captures a sentiment that is relevant and powerful, and some of those who push back on the motto have no problem with the language, "Make America Great Again," which smacks of imperialism, racism, and other isms. The Black Lives Matter movement, which is seen in people around the world peacefully protesting against the injustice that has been perpetrated against black men and people of color since the beginning of this country, sounds like a biblical Christian movement to take part in. Let me ask some questions. What has happened to the prophetic impetus of the Bible, which speaks truth to power? What has happened to the compassionate impetus of God's people in the Bible, who speak for those who have no voice? Where are those who are willing to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and be a friend of publicans and sinners? Where are those who speak up against American Christianity, which posits Christianity in terms of submitting to power and being the only truth that is relevant? God has given us truth in the Bible, but it is not in the form of propositional statement. Rather, it is primarily the story with commentary, guided by traditions in the church. I didn't say tradition because there's not just one tradition. If you understand church history and you study church tradition, there are many church traditions. We must discern God's message to the original people in the original place at the original time, and then apply that truth to our own cultural context. So what we have in Christianity is the interpretation of the Bible through the social location of white male patriarchy. And that position is treated as truth, because it has power and because it is dominant. White conservative male Christianity speaks with the objective voice as if they are talking from nowhere, and pretends that they have no social location, no class, no gender, no race, and little empathy or imagination. It is the voice of patriarchy, and it encourages the status quo. Liberalism, in contrast, encourages the perennial progress towards a dream that refuses to face the reality of darkness and evil and failure. Yet, we all interpret the Bible from our social location, and those interpretations may be true from our point of view and legitimate. There's truth in the fact that there are times that we should be submissive. There is truth in the fact that there are times when we should suffer and learn from that suffering. there's also truth in the reality that the doctrine of submission has been used to keep the powerless in bondage. And there are times when God uses and gives us courage to pursue our freedom. Isn't that why the Europeans came to America in the first place? Consequently, the truth of submission and suffering must be in dialogue with the truth of freedom and courage, because both streams of truth are found in the Bible. It just so happens that after many years of the dominance of white evangelical truth, praise God, other versions of truth are gaining in power and legitimacy, and also must be brought to the table and dealt with. Finally, although I cannot endorse the philosophy and the ideology of the Black Lives Matter organization, that does not keep me from participating in the moment, in their motto, and in the movement where it does not violate my biblical convictions. What is really ironic is that white Christian evangelicals have no trouble proclaiming Donald Trump God's choice for this hour, a man who is obviously racist, obviously misogynist, vulgar, who doesn't seem to have any commitment to the truth, but cannot see the same white evangelical Christians cannot see how God might use an organization whose philosophy might be wrong. It seems that they are straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. Consequently, through the Spirit, we can discern the moment. We can think through the motto. We can support the movement through nonviolent protesting, while still choosing not to support the LGBTQ agenda. We can still stand in integrity and say that Black lives matter. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I hope that God will use what I've said to create some semblance of balance and biblical perspective in all that is going on. You have a great evening. I'll be doing these on Thursday evening for a while. Some people have been asking me to continue. I was just going to stop, but I'm going to do them for whoever wants them. Have a great evening. God bless you.